Joining me now is well-known Hollywood filmmaker M. Night Shyamalan. He's directed movies such as The Sixth Sense and The Last Airbender, among others. Shyamalan has traveled extensively throughout the United States, researching falling education standards in the country. Based on those experiences, he wrote the book I Got Schooled that details key ways to improve education in the United States. Night, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You are a movie director. What got you interested in reforming the U.S. education system?
I think the subject of this achievement gap, the gap between inner city low-income children, which are 98% African-American kids, and white suburban kids, that gap that exists in education, came naturally, organically. Honestly, I'm not a do-gooder. I'm a very selfish. I love to play basketball, make movies, and be with my family. That's it. You know, I'm fine. I'm probably not the greatest in terms of thinking about other people and all that stuff. My wife is. So this is unusual to be here. And also, I kind of detest celebrities that do activist work, like because they're good at something else doesn't mean they can talk.
They do get hurt, though.
What is it?
They do
get spotlight on subjects, and I understand it, but I feel resistant to that idea, and that's why I've never really been in that position or wanted to accept that position. But this is really became from a sense of being a parent and wanting to learn. It just was about me wanting to learn what is the problem and are there solutions in the data, and approaching it in a very evidence-based way.
Now, you talk about the achievement gap. How did you first come across this gap?
You know, again, very organically. I was location scouting a movie, and we were looking for high schools in Philadelphia. I live in Philadelphia. And we went to a high school, and it was just a beautiful institution. The kids and the atmosphere, the classrooms, everything. And I would love my kids to go there, kind of feeling. Then we got in the van and went just 4 minutes away in Philadelphia to another school, and there were metal detectors. We had to take off our metal. There was guards at the front. All the classrooms had bars on them. It was a very different atmosphere. The kids were walking very slowly and depressed. The top floor of the school had been shut down for drug use and sex, and the theater had been burnt down. And this was just a school just a few minutes away from the other school, and it upset me. This was in my city of Philadelphia, and this is the level of education we're getting. What's the difference between the schools? So that became very important to me to understand the difference between those two schools.
You know, the question that is often asked, and I get asked this when I travel around the world as well, when it comes to education in the United States, this is the richest country in the world. I mean, how does one explain the fact that you've got public schools which are overcrowded, which are under-resourced, teachers are poorly paid? I mean, how does one explain that? Well,
a bunch of the things you said are misconceptions, what you just said. But to answer the beginning of your question, we are not educating a certain group, and the other kids were educating very well. If you took all the schools in the United States that had 10% poverty or less, and you compared them to the rest of the world, we're #1 in education. Those schools are primarily white, and so in a very broad sense, we're educating our affluent white kids at the highest level of the entire world. We're beating everybody. Now, with regard to these inner city low-income schools, which are 98% African American, we are doing the worst job possible with that group. And ultimately, I don't want to be inflammatory, but ultimately it's based on racism. It really is. The country was built on a contradiction. Everyone's equal, and yet slavery is okay. And then up until just the 1960s, it was condoned, sanctioned to be a racist. It was sanctioned to have different expectations. And we're pretending in just this amount of time, my dad's generation, that group and that mentality has changed, which it hasn't. It's still there. The messaging is still there. And that's what actually you find from the data that says these kids are still getting the same message that they were getting in 1960, and they need to be protected.
Right, so it's a broader problem than just improving education. You've got to change attitudes as well.
Well, the question of the book is, can you educate these kids? Can you close this gap without changing the environment outside of the school?
Can you?
Yes, you can.
Well, you mentioned the book. It's called I Got Schooled. The full title is The Unlikely Story of How a Moonlighting Movie Maker Learned the 5 Keys to Closing America's Education Gaps. The cynics may say, what does a movie maker know about education? And you would say?
definitely be cynical. 100% be cynical. Go into it with absolute cynicism and then read it, because I tried very hard to leave all opinion out of it and said, are you aware of these things? So, you know, now after 5 years, I'm going, are you aware there is no data to support vouchers? Are you aware that accountability alone has no connection to achievement gains with students? Are you aware of how much the kids are losing in the summer? Are you aware of these things? This is what the data says. This is a collection of data. This isn't me. This is 150 studies on how much does, you know, paying teachers more, how much does that improve student achievement gains?
Right. Children are also the product of their environments. You know, you pointed out just now, it's what happens outside the school. Is the problem here in the United States the fact that they adopt a one-size-fits-all system for educating children? You know, we've got standardized testing. I mean, that's across the board, no matter where you come from. That's a test you do.
We first have to acknowledge what the problem is, right? So the data says, right now, the public opinion is, what's wrong with our inner city schools? That's not correct. It's what's wrong with our country that has to be solved in our inner city schools. That's the correct way to think about it. That's now the blame has been switched. So if you start thinking that way, you will see the data properly. You will see that accountability alone does nothing, because the assumption that it's a motivational thing for these teachers and principals is inherently incorrect. These schools need to be taught differently, the inner city schools.
Right, you spent years working on this. Have you detected a recognition that this is a serious problem and has to be looked at in the way that you are talking about right now? I mean, under George Bush, we had no child left behind. What happened to that?
Well, for example, so if you continue to go under the premise that the problem is in the schools, you're going to do incorrect things. No child left behind is, again, accountability alone, right? You cannot do accountability until you give knowledge. You can't say, now you're a Navy SEAL. You have to train them to be a Navy SEAL and then test them to see if they're qualified. You can't do it reverse. You can't, I'm going to give you the Navy SEAL test. Impossible. I have to be trained, right? And in this way, if we start thinking about that, you'll see that everything has been flipped at this point.
To what extent is the problem in the United States a political problem? Because, you know, politicians, in some instances, may pay lip service to what the problems that you're talking about, for the simple reason that poor people, and as you say, most of them are black people, have no political clout.
Well, here's the thing. This is the problem. If everyone doesn't understand that smoking is bad for you, nothing can be done, right? Everyone has to understand the truth of the data. That means the population has to understand that. You know, the politicians have to understand it. They will be in a quandary if they have to be elected on small class size when it doesn't have an impact, right? As opposed to, you know, everyone's educated, everyone knows the exact same details, then he can say, I believe in this so strongly, we need to protect these kids. We're going to do all of these things that the data says to protect. It's really about knowledge. Now, your subtext of your question is, why hasn't this been done? Why hasn't this been told? Why isn't this an evidence-based field? Why isn't it? Medicine isn't gut. You don't guess about heart surgery. You don't want to go to somebody who's guessing, who's using their gut instinct about where to cut. You want data and evidence from everywhere in the world. You want best practices. Why haven't we approached this particular subject with that data? And that is a very interesting question, because I do think it's about a population we don't care about, and this country has never cared about. And that's why there hasn't been a lot of, you know, hey, these kids can learn, and it's our burden. We're the ones that made this problem. We need to correct it. We don't take that responsibility on ourselves.
You know, there's been a lot of reports that we've seen about education around the world. We often see Finland being mentioned. We often see South Korea being mentioned. Education systems, very good, very successful.
Yes.
Have you looked at those systems? Do they do things differently?
Well, here's the other problem. Again, what is the problem? And the data says it's racism. It's this country's racism is what we're talking about when we're talking about this population. For example, if you looked at the schools in the United States that were only 10%, have 10% poverty, 1 in 10 of the kids were in poverty, those schools are leading the world. Finland doesn't have a racism problem. Their country was not built on slavery. Their poorest group, economic group, and their richest economic group are 5.6 times apart. Not that far apart. Ours is 16 times apart. We have a very different problem. How they educate their kids is very different than what our problem is. When we're talking about this population, the children of the people that we have disenfranchised, how do we teach them? Because we've taught them something, which is they're powerless. How do we undo that? That's what the research is talking about. In fact, we're teaching our affluent white kids better than anybody.
What kind of reception has your book had, and the ideas in it, the 5 steps in it?
You know, shockingly, not shockingly, because I'll tell you what, when I was doing the research, I didn't find any villains. That's the amazing thing about the data. Why everyone took their positions makes total sense based on when you look at the history of the data and what's happened, the misunderstandings, the false positives, the false negatives that have happened, where the country ran down small schools, where the country ran down vouchers based on one study in Milwaukee or whatever it is. I get it. I get how everyone took their positions, you know? They want to blame the teachers circle, you know, circle each other, you know, they're getting blamed needlessly, they're not being taught how to do it, you know, all those things. I get it. I didn't find the villains, and because that's truly what I feel and truly what the data says, I'm not getting enemies, because the data says, honestly, some of the education reform people some of what they do is correct and some of it isn't. You're going on opinion, and there should be no opinion with regard to these children. And with regard to the teachers union, a lot of what they say is accurate and some of it isn't. And that's what data is. It's blind to sides.
Okay, we talk about the race of the school kids, those
Sure.
being educated. What about the race of the teachers, those doing the teaching?
You know, there is no color, background, anything that predisposes you to be a better teacher. There is no trait that you can find beforehand. The truck driver or the Princeton A student, you don't know which one is the better teacher. It's this magical alchemy of traits that make you a great teacher, a connection, an empathy, whatever it is. It's ineffable at this moment. You can't. That's the beauty of teaching. You have to be in the classroom for 3 years before you even know if you're a great teacher. Almost everyone hurts their class in their first year.
You know, we've heard a lot about certain individuals who've just taken it upon themselves to teach others, and they do it via the internet. And we live in a fortunate time when that can be done.
Yeah.
Thinking of people like the Khan Academy,
Yes.
charter schools.
Yes.
I mean, what role do those play?
You know, there's not enough data that's with regard to this population. I'm only been looking at data with regard to this 18% of the schools in the United States and how to help these children. How to make the rest of the kids learn better, I don't know. I don't have that data. But with regard to, did you mix in their charter schools, did you say?
Yes.
Well, again, charter schools, again, are not the answer. They are an environment that allows some of these things to be done. For example, when you look at the data on charter schools, this is the facts. 17% of them outperform the district schools, 17%. And then you have the other group. I think it's 46% are even. And then 37% are worse. That's the facts. That's the facts. Now, originally charter schools were invented by a union teacher to do best practices to bring back to the district. And that's exactly what should be done. A lot of the findings in the book, a lot of the research are based on this 17% of the schools that are closing the gap. Now, when the pro-reformers say, why don't they fire their teachers over here? These guys should fire back. Why don't you close your charter schools that are terrible? You know, both of them think they're doing good work. Everyone's coming from a good place. They're trying their best for their kids. I really didn't find enemies, but it's funny that both sides are very similar.
Knight, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And good luck with your efforts.
Thank you, buddy.